welcome to this week's video. So what we're going to be covering today is how being a perfectionist can negatively and positively impact our sport and performance and our approach to the gym, whether it be losing weight and gaining muscle or whatever athletic or physical goals you have, and how having a perfectionist attitude can both positively and negatively affect us. So we're going to cover what is perfectionism. So a lot of us use this term, and we hear this quite a lot, don't we? We hear people say, "Oh, I'm a bit of a perfectionist," and who knows whether these people are or not, or whether we are or not. But we're going to cover what it actually is and the different sides of it. Okay, so that leads us into the next point in terms of there's two definitions and two dimensions of perfectionism, which I'm going to go through today. And maybe you can identify with what one of them you are if you are someone who's a bit of a perfectionist. And then the third point we're going to look at, which is probably the most important bit, is does it set us up for failure or success? So is this perfectionism actually serving us and helping us achieve our goals, specifically in the gym, weight loss, athletic performance, or is it hindering us? And I'll touch more on that when we get to that point, okay? So the definition of perfectionism, there's a couple of different definitions, and this one here is, I think personally, it leads a little bit more towards the negative side of perfectionism, but we are going to explore both sides of it today. So perfectionism is typically defined as a personality trait characterized by a person striving for flawlessness and setting excessively high performance standards for themselves, often accompanied by critical self-evaluations and concerns about mistakes and failures. So if we analyse the definition there, the positives in it would say, for example, we're striving for flawlessness. If we change that word to striving to be better, for example, it sounds a lot more achievable, doesn't it? Where I think the negative side of this is the flawlessness, because as we know, in most walks of life, there's no such thing as flawlessness. And then same with setting high performance standards. That sounds great, but when you put the word in setting excessively high performance standards, then it starts to sound a little bit more negative. So already you can sort of pick this apart in terms of how being a little bit of a perfectionist may be a good thing, but if it goes too far, it may have a detriment to our performance. So we'll go more into that in a minute. And then this is the really important part now, where it says critical self-evaluation and concerns about mistakes and failures. Again, we're going to look at that more, but that can be the negative side of being a perfectionist, and what can potentially be driving that perfectionism is the critical self-evaluation and the concerns about mistakes and failures. So we'll look at that more in a minute and see if that resonates with you. But as it says here, overall perfectionism is a complex construct that can have both positive and negative consequences for individuals' well-being and performance. And then what I want you to think about now, just before we get on to the next slide, is does this resonate with you when it comes to your sport or training? So are you someone potentially who, I'll start the gym when I can do everything perfect, and when I can go 5 times a week, when I've got no social events that are going to throw me off from eating chicken and broccoli every single day, or if it's in a sporting aspect, are you someone who, when you can't train a million times a day doing your sport, do you think that you are not training hard enough and you want to do more, you want to do more, you want to do more? Are you someone who potentially, when you have a bad day at training for your sport, you're very, very critical of yourself, even though it could be for a number of reasons? It could be because you've had lack of sleep, because you are cutting weight, because your training partner's really fresh and you're 6 weeks into a training camp, but are you consistently hard on yourself because you're looking for perfection? So yeah, just think about that now for me. Does any of this resonate with you before we get on to the next slide? When we're looking at the research around perfectionism, a lot of the research has identified 2 dimensions of perfectionism. And I think this is really interesting because the more I think about it in myself, the more I can see this. So hopefully this resonates with yourself. So the positive side of perfectionism is called perfectionist striving. So what this means is it's someone who's characterized by setting very high standards and striving for perfection. So this potentially can be A positive side, which I'll go into a little bit more. But in terms of this, we are striving for high standards and we're striving for perfection. Like we are genuinely wanting to do the best we physically can, and we're looking for that standard. The possible negative side of this is called perfectionists' concerns, and this I sort of resonate a little bit with, if I'm being brutally honest, in the past throughout my career. And this can be characterised by the fear of mistakes, judgment from others, and not reaching one's expectations. So throughout my military career, like obviously it's quite a, what's the word? It's quite fierce for competition in terms of being the best soldier, being the best whatever, getting promoted, and you're constantly judged by your last mistake. That was what I sort of summarised from my army career. It's not so much what you're doing well; it's what you're expected to do well. If you're a decent soldier, it's when you make a mistake that's when you're judged. So for me, I had a lot of this. I was like trying to get things right out of the fear of making a mistake and the judgment of my bosses and my peers, which would impact my career. And then obviously that was backed up by not reaching expectations. So I had quite a lot of this perfectionist concerns throughout my army career. Obviously I battled them and dealt with them, but this is where you could say when I was doing a really good job, that was more out of perfectionist concerns, opposed to perfectionist striving. If I'm brutally honest, I wasn't doing it because I wanted to be the best at that thing I was doing. I didn't want to be the best person running a sports competition. Personally, I couldn't care. I done it out of the second reason, out of the mistake, the judgment, and so on. So it's quite interesting when you look at it that way. If you're brutally honest with yourself, and that's what I want you to ask yourself now, if you are a little bit of a perfectionist, why is it you are when it comes to these certain things? And like I said, specifically when it comes to the gym, when it comes to your health, when it comes to sport, what one are you, and what one fuels your perfectionism? Is it striving or is it the concerns? When we're looking at the research a little bit more in depth, there's a correlation between these two fuels of perfectionism. So when we look at concerns, these were related to higher scores of burnout and training distress, and also a lower perceived performance. So when the studies analysed the burnout rates, which we've covered in previous lectures, what burnout is, and also training distress and the perceived performance, these people performed a lot lower than they would have if they weren't in this state of perfectionist concerns, okay? Compared to people on the opposite side who were perfectionist striving, they were related to higher perceived performance scores and lower scores of burnout, which makes sense, and to be honest, is quite common. It's a bit of common sense, isn't it? From our previous slide, we can see how having that ambition to do the best you can and striving for a high standard because you want to achieve that standard, opposed to doing it for the reasons that I mentioned at times. It's a no brainer that the one I mentioned is going to have a negative effect on your performance long term and cause higher scores and burnout. Okay. So as it says here, the study suggests that the perfectionist concerns, they don't really adapt to the situations over time, whereas the perfectionist, this actually may help the athlete and help them adapt to their environments continuously throughout their sport and training. All right, so it does show there's the variance in the two dimensions. So just perfectionism as a whole can't be deemed positive or negative, but when you go a little bit deeper into it and look at the reason for the perfectionism, that is the one where there's a variance in outcomes depending on what the fuel is for that. All right, so sort of to recap, to summarize and to go into like sort of a strategy, which a lot of the research looks at, is I just want to read this last paragraph. In a real world, it may be difficult to foster a purely perfectionist striving mentality, which we all agree, in our walks of life, and especially when we're looking at sports performance, we're looking at weight loss, we're looking at gym work. It's impossible to be perfect. If you're an athlete, your training is never going to be perfect, and if you're an athlete, listen to this, you know that, because otherwise you're not an athlete, because if your training's always perfect, then I would argue you're not training hard enough, you're not training with good enough people, you're not at the level of competition that you should be, because you'll know it's not perfect. If you're wanting to lose weight, it's not perfect. There's times where you eat 2 million bloody Krispy Kremes. There's times when you have a night out where you go a bit rogue and you don't track all your calories. Nothing is perfect. So when we're striving for purely for perfection, it can be a negative to us, especially when it comes to sport and our gym work. So what I want you to think about here now is a better strategy may be, and as I say there, with fewer potential downsides of pursuit of excellence would be, downsides of perfectionism would be to look at the pursuit of excellence. If we think of that quote and that phrase there, if we are pursuing excellence, then we are just working to be the best version of ourselves in that current moment and in that current state of being an athlete, of trying to lose weight. And then we're focusing on self-improvement and giving ourselves high standards. I think that's the key difference here. We're looking to improve ourselves from where we are today. So without being too cringy, better tomorrow than we were yesterday. That constant mindset of like trying to improve each day, each week, each month, each year is much better than just trying to be a perfectionist in the whatever realm we're talking about, okay? And I say that a lot to athletes I coach, and I do say it a lot to the people in Elevate as well. Life in terms of sport and the gym work is not won or lost in one single session. It's made up of multiple sessions over weeks, months and years. So let's use an athlete, for example, if you're a fighter. If one day you are absolutely knackered and you have hurt your leg and you've been up all night with the baby and your calories are low, chatting with your coach and discussing like what you should do this today, and maybe your coach suggesting a lower intensity session or a rest or whatever, that might not be you seeking perfection, but is it not better that you're pursuing excellence long term? So in that short moment, you have to deviate from what you perceive as perfection to go forward. I think that's a really good way of looking at it in terms of helping us keep very high standards for ourselves and being truly honest with ourselves, opposed to just seeking every single day to be perfect, because it's unrealistic in an ever-changing world. To summarise then, and some key takeaway points, okay? So the first one is, I want you to identify what dimension of perfectionism are you fueling your perfectionism from. So like I said about the army and using that as an example, have a look why you are looking for perfection in these certain areas, okay? And be honest with yourself, and then from that, you can then begin to acknowledge this behaviour and understand how it may not be helping you progress. So like I said, if we're using the gym, for example, if you're not willing to commit to tracking the calories just yet because you've got loads going on and you just think like, oh no, I won't stick to it, so I'm not going to start till I can stick to it 100%. That attitude is hindering you and stopping you from going forward. If you start today and you do 60, 70, 80%, it's better than doing nothing for the next week and starting trying to get 100%, because you won't get 100% anyway. You'll end up being 60, 70, 80% anyway, because that's realistic. Okay? And then the final point, as I mentioned, which I really like personally and have used in the past, is look at the pursuit of excellence approach as an alternative method to looking for perfectionism. Having a pursuit of excellence is going to help you have high standards on a daily basis, which are going to build over a week, a month, a year, and overall your output is going to be high as an athlete and both as an individual trying to live a healthier, stronger life. Okay, so that caps up this week's video. If anyone's got any questions at all, please let me know, and I'll look to cover them in future videos.